Introduction. The battlefield is no place for miracles, or so they say. It is mud, blood, and steel. It is men huddled in foxholes, praying the shells overhead don't find them. It is the sound of boots crunching in snow, the whistle of incoming fire, and the sight of friends falling beside you. And yet, in the very heart of hell, stories emerged that defy logic. Stories whispered by soldiers who swore they saw the impossible. Stories of prayers answered against all odds, of angels appearing in the smoke, of visions of Christ in the mud and fire. Stories that refuse to die because they are too powerful, too strange, and too full of hope to be forgotten. This is not a history book. This is not a sermon. This is a journey into the mystery of war, the clash between human despair and divine intervention. You'll walk with paratroopers as they hit the beaches of Normandy, with a chaplain who carried no weapon but faith. You'll sit with a starving prisoner of war who begged for a single banana and got it in a way that can only be called miraculous. You'll stand with 9 soldiers who swear an angel led them out of death's shadow. You'll hear the prayer of a priest that turned the skies themselves. And you'll meet a soldier who looked death in the face and saw Jesus standing beside him. These are not fairy tales. These are the testimonies of men and women who faced the valley of the shadow of death and lived to tell us what they saw. You may doubt them. You may explain them away. But for those who lived them, these moments were more real than the bullets flying overhead. This is Bullets and Blessings, Miracles in the Midst of War. Chapter 1. The Parachute Padre. June 6th, 1944. Normandy. The night sky rumbled like an angry giant as flak exploded in bursts of fire. Men gripped their parachute lines, faces pale in the red glow of tracer rounds streaking past. In the belly of a C-47, among hardened paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, one man clutched not a rifle, but a small black mass kit. His name was Father Francis L. Sampson. The soldiers called him the Parachute Padre. When the green light flashed, the men jumped into chaos. The sky itself seemed on fire. Bullets whistled past, and men screamed as the wind swallowed them. Father Sampson hit the ground hard, far from his unit, in a countryside alive with machine guns and shouting in German. He could have hidden. He could have waited. But instead he ran to the cries of the wounded. Crawling through hedgerows slick with blood, he whispered last rites into trembling ears, pressed bandages to torn flesh, and prayed words of courage over boys who thought they'd never see the sunrise again. Hours later, German soldiers captured him. They shoved him against a wall, rifles raised. His life hung by a trigger. But then, in the blur of fear, a German officer stepped forward, himself a Catholic. Seeing the chaplain's cross, he ordered the firing squad to stand down. In that instant, life triumphed over death. Father Sampson's mission wasn't finished. Weeks later, in Bastogne, the hell of the Battle of the Bulge unfolded. Snow fell thick and wet, mixing with blood in the foxholes. The men of the 101st were freezing, starving, surrounded, and outnumbered. And there, moving through the icy trenches like a shadow, was the Parachute Padre. Shells screamed overhead as he knelt beside terrified soldiers, whispering prayers in the dark. He held trembling hands, gave comfort to the dying, and reminded the living that they were not alone. Hope itself seemed to walk the line with him. Years later, veterans of Bastogne would say they remembered little of the speeches of generals, but they would never forget the sight of Father Sampson, mud-stained and fearless, crawling from foxhole to foxhole with nothing but faith. To them, he was more than a chaplain. He was proof that in the darkest night of war, light can still break through. Chapter 2. The Missionary and the Banana. The jungle prison reeked of sweat, sickness, and despair. The Japanese guards had dragged in another load of captives, missionaries, soldiers, civilians. faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Among them was a young American missionary woman named Darlene Diebler Rose. She was locked away in a filthy cell, her body weak from malnutrition, her spirit crushed by loneliness. Her crime? Her faith, and being caught in the crossfire of war. Day after day, she endured the brutal routine, the lash of orders she couldn't understand, the scraping of bowls half filled with watery rice, the nights broken by screams from nearby cells. She prayed, though her prayers often felt as dry as her throat, and yet, in that suffocating darkness, she longed for something so small it seemed ridiculous. A banana. A single, golden, ripe banana. She whispered it to God one night, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. Lord, I would love just one banana. The next morning, footsteps thundered down the hall. Guards shouted and a commanding officer stopped at her cell. Darlene braced herself for punishment, but instead, he barked an order, and a soldier placed something inside her prison. Her eyes widened. There, on the ground, were bananas. Not one, not two, but an entire stalk. More than a dozen, green and gold, fresh from the tree. She fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands trembling over the miracle. Lord, she whispered, I only asked for one. She knew the guards didn't give out bananas. She knew this had no explanation. It was too outrageous, too lavish. It was grace in its purest form, heaven touching a hellhole in the South Pacific. For Darlene, those bananas weren't just food. They were proof. Proof that she was not forgotten. Proof that God could break through prison walls with something as simple and as miraculous as a stalk of fruit. Years later, when she told her story, she would say the bananas were the sweetest she had ever tasted in her life, because they tasted of hope. Chapter 3. The Angel and the 9 Soldiers. The night was black as coal. Snow and smoke swirled through the Ardennes forest, muffling sound, swallowing light. 9 American soldiers crouched low in a shell crater, their rifles nearly empty, their nerves shredded raw. Around them, German voices echoed through the trees. They were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off. The men exchanged glances that needed no words. They all knew what it meant. Dawn would not find them alive. One soldier whispered a prayer, another cursed, another held tight to a letter from home, as if the ink on the page could shield him from bullets. And then it happened. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared, not stumbling like a soldier, not creeping like an enemy. Calm, steady, radiant in a way the men could never quite describe. Some said he glowed faintly, like moonlight in human form. Others swore he looked like any man, except for the peace in his eyes. The figure raised a hand, and somehow every soldier felt the same command without hearing a word. Follow me. Trembling, half in disbelief, they obeyed. Crawling out of the crater, they trailed behind this silent guide as he led them through the maze of trees and enemy patrols. Not once did a German soldier spot them. Not once did a shot ring out. It was as if the forest itself bent to shield their escape. Finally, the figure stopped at the edge of a clearing. The men blinked, their breath frosting in the cold air. Ahead of them were American lines, salvation, reinforcements. When they turned to thank their guide, he was gone. No footprints, no sound. Nothing but the hush of the forest and the pounding of their own hearts. 9 soldiers staggered into camp that night, their story too impossible to believe. Some kept silent, afraid of ridicule. Others told it as it was. They had been led out by an angel. Whether heaven had truly sent a messenger in the flesh, or whether God himself had wrapped them in invisibility, they would never know. But this they did know. When all hope was gone, when death was certain, deliverance came. And it came in a way no bullet, no army, and no man could explain. Chapter 4. The Weather Prayer. December 1944. The Ardennes was a frozen nightmare. Snow drifts piled high, the cold gnawed through boots and bone, and the German army had launched a ferocious counterattack that came to be called the Battle of the Bulge. American troops were exhausted, surrounded, and outgunned, and to make matters worse, a relentless storm pinned Allied planes to the ground, keeping reinforcements and supplies from reaching the men who needed them most. General George S. Patton paced his headquarters like a caged lion, his temper sparking as he watched the skies dump sleet and snow. "We must find a way to pray for better weather," he growled. And so he turned to his chaplain, Monsignor James Hugh O'Neill. Father O'Neill knew what Patton was asking, a prayer not just for sunshine, but for survival. He returned with words scratched onto a small card, words that would soon be passed to thousands of soldiers. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Amen." Patton read it, nodded, and then did something extraordinary. He ordered 250,000 copies printed and distributed to every man in the Third Army, along with his own command. Pray it. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, frostbitten and weary, bowed their heads and whispered the words into the storm. And then the skies began to break. Snow gave way to cold, clear air. The ground hardened. The sun burned through the clouds. Suddenly, the roar of Allied aircraft filled the sky. Bombers and fighters streaked overhead, pounding German positions, dropping supplies, and giving new life to the men who had been all but written off. To the soldiers shivering in the foxholes, it felt like heaven itself had parted the clouds in answer to their prayer. General Patton would later pin a bronze star on Chaplain O'Neill, calling him the man whose prayer helped change the course of battle. But O'Neill, humble and clear-eyed, knew the truth. It was not his prayer alone, but the faith of desperate soldiers, crying out together that shifted the heavens. To the men of the Bulge, it was nothing less than a miracle in the snow. Chapter 5. A special animal saves an army veteran. The night was heavy, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made every breath feel like a burden. Rain splattered against the barracks, sliding down the cold concrete steps where Army Specialist Josh Marino sat hunched over, cigarette burning low between his fingers. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside his head. His uniform was damp, his eyes hollow, and his will to live gone. Back in his room, a knife rested on the bedside table. On his computer screen, a suicide note waited like a grim confession. He had typed it carefully, hoping that when someone read it, they would understand why. Why the pain, the memories, the weight of war had finally crushed him. This cigarette was meant to be his last. Each drag felt like the countdown to silence. But then, through the rain, he heard it. A faint rustling, a meow. He frowned, turning his head. Out of the shadows padded a small black and white kitten, soaked but determined, its green eyes glowing in the dim light. Josh blinked, confused. Of all the nights, of all the places, why here? The kitten trotted right up to him, tail flicking, and pressed against his leg. Josh felt a warmth he hadn't expected, the simple, insistent comfort of another living thing that didn't care about his scars, his past, or his brokenness. It just wanted to be with him. He dropped the cigarette and, almost without thinking, reached down to stroke the tiny creature. The kitten purred, steady and strong, as if it were saying, "Stay. You're not done yet." Josh stayed outside for a long time that night, the rain washing over him, his hand on the small animal that had chosen him. Something shifted. The knife, the note, the plan. They began to lose their grip. He didn't feel healed. He didn't feel whole. But for the first time in months, he felt something stir inside. Hope. The kitten became his reason to get up, his reason to fight through one more day. Later, Josh would say that night changed everything. The sound of a meow in the dark pulled him back from the edge. The companionship of that stray cat gave him what no doctor, no medicine, no therapy session had managed to give him: a will to live. He adopted the kitten, naming him Scout, and together they began a new chapter. Scout wasn't just a pet. He was a lifeline, a little soldier in fur, fighting off despair every day by simply being there, purring, playing, reminding Josh that life was still worth holding on to. The army had trained Josh to survive combat. Scout trained him to survive coming home. Years later, when Josh told his story to other veterans, he didn't hold back. "That cat saved my life," he would say, and no one who heard him doubted it. Because in a world where war tears holes in the soul, sometimes miracles don't arrive in angelic light or booming prayers from heaven. Sometimes they come on four paws, with whiskers, a purr, and a simple reminder that even in the darkest night, you are not alone. Conclusion: bullets and blessings. War leaves scars. Some you can see: the limp of a leg that never healed right, the jagged line of shrapnel across a soldier's skin. But others run deeper: the nightmares, the silence at the dinner table, the ache of remembering things you can't forget. War is mud and blood and brokenness. But it is also, astonishingly, a place where miracles walk. You've heard the stories. A chaplain who dropped into Normandy with no weapon but faith, crawling through snow and shellfire to whisper prayers that steadied trembling hands. A starving missionary in a prison cell who asked for one banana and received a miracle in a whole stalk. 9 soldiers, surrounded in the forest, who followed an angel to safety. A prayer in the mud of the Ardennes that cracked open the heavens and turned storms into sunshine. A soldier on the edge of death who swore he saw Jesus kneel beside him. And a broken veteran who found his reason to live again in the quiet purr of a stray cat. These are not tales dressed up for Sunday sermons. These are raw, muddy, flesh and blood stories. They happened in foxholes, in prison camps, on blood-soaked ground, and in the lonely shadows of barracks. And yet, in every one of them, something greater broke through. Something beyond bullets and bombs. Something no army could command and no enemy could stop. Call it a miracle. Call it providence. Call it grace. Whatever name you choose, it was light in the darkest of nights. It was proof that even in war, where chaos rules and death reigns, heaven has not turned its face away. So when you feel surrounded, when life feels like a battlefield, remember these stories. Remember the parachute Padre in the foxholes of Bastogne. Remember the woman who tasted the sweetness of a banana in a place of despair. Remember the angel in the Ardennes, the prayer that changed the skies, the soldier who saw Jesus, and the veteran saved by a cat named Scout. Remember that miracles are not locked away in ancient times or dusty books. They walk among us, sometimes in combat boots, sometimes in fur, always reminding us that we are not abandoned. This is the truth of war and the hope of life, that bullets may fly, but blessings still fall. That darkness may press in, but light always finds a way through. That even in the mud, even in the blood, even in the silence of the foxhole, you are never, ever alone.